And welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
So we are in Parshat Mishpatim, and we had actually just started another subject and stopped in the middle of it. And so I'm going to go back to the previous verse where it talks about it, right here. This symbol here implies that there's a paragraph, a closed paragraph in the Sefer Torah, that in the actual scroll itself, the line starts with a word or two, and then there's a space, and then there are more words. So there'd be a space between this word and this word that would indicate a closed paragraph. So there are two types of paragraphs in the Torah. There's one that's called a petucha, and that's where there would be no more words. It would be like more of a regular paragraph. It's petucha, patuach, open, and this samach stands for stuma, for closed, right? Patuach, so if this was an open paragraph, here there'd be a pay instead of a samach. At any rate, this is a case of someone who seduces a woman, right? In a specific case. V'chi yifte ish betula. If a man seduces a woman, asher lo orasa, who is not betrothed, so she has at this point no relationship with another man. V'shachav ima, and he lay with her, meaning, of course, that he had intimate relations with her. Mahor yimharena lo leisha. He must set aside a dowry for her to become his wife. So, of course, there's just so many issues that one could raise about this. But right now, our job is simply to understand the Torah on its basic level. And it's going to go on, and you'll see, all right, what it says. This is where we left off. Im ma'en yima'en aviha letitalo. If her father refuses, and basically this doubling of the word is understood generally as sort of an intensive form. In other words, if her father uh, absolutely refuses letitalo, to give her to him. That's actually the issue going on, right? At any rate, let's go on and see. Kesef Yishkol, this is the person who seduced his, he still has to, this would be weigh out money, silver, kemohar habitulot, according to the dowry of virgins.
So
And yeah,
you
go
already
ahead.
did the Rashi for verse 15?
I did. Yes. So let's go on. Right. Let me see if right. Let me do this end of this Rashi here, right? So he says, oh dear. I'm sorry about this. Let me see what I can do about it. Hmm. Let's see what I can do. I don't know why it did that. Let me see if I can just press escape. I may have to go out of this and back in. It's not letting me do this. Let's try this. Okay, that's better. Okay. Now it's sort of doing weird things again. That's funny. Okay. So Mohayim Harena is what I'm looking at here, and I'm gonna have to mess with this again. Give me one moment and see if I can do this. Yeah. Okay, that's better, I hope. He explains this word mohar, which is again an unusual or infrequent word. Yifsok la mohar. He must set aside for her a dowry, kamishpat ish leishto, like a man who is marrying a woman. Remember this, the father is refusing to let this man marry his daughter. And nevertheless, I think the point of this essentially is that the person who seduced still has to give her a dowry, right? Just as if he were, in fact, marrying a woman under normal circumstances. Shekotev la ketuva vayisa'ena. This is, in other words, like a situation of a man who would have to give a ketubah to his wife and marry her. That's even though he is not going to marry her. But of course, she's no longer going to be considered a virgin. And I realize, this gets into values that are in some ways conflict with the values we have now. I just have to let it go as it stands. I think, at least on some level, we can try and understand where they're coming from and see if there's a value to what they're saying about how we deal with issues of intimate relationships. Okay.
Rabbi, mine says Mahor instead of Mohar.
Okay, let me see. Oh, Mahor is here in the first thing, right? But this is, are you saying in the Rashi it says Mahor?
Yes.
Interesting. This is definitely Mohar. You see the Vav here, right? So it would have to be Mohar. And it actually makes more
And
sense.
mine doesn't have the Vav. It's just completely different and it's punctuated.
It's interesting because this is a noun, right? And how is yours read?
He must allocate for her a dowry.
But why the Hebrew the way it is, right? Is that in the Hebrew itself, in the Rashi itself?
It
Because
says, yeah, it says Yim Harina
yeah, that's
Yifsoklam
that's
Mohar.
right. Okay, there we go. That's what I'm reading. Yivsoklo mohar. That's what I just read.
Okay.
Okay, the catchphrase is up here. Mahor yimharena. That's the
Yeah,
verse
and mine
quoting
says
from the
Mohar. Maybe
Pasuk.
it's a mistake.
Okay, all right.
Let's
Well,
see what it says.
it may not be. I don't know. All right, let's
Yeah,
go.
it does, and it doesn't. Yeah, mine has it in the text to Mahor
Okay,
with
okay. All right.
and
So you're
no
saying
and no Vav.
In the Rashi itself it does. That is in
Both,
his
yeah.
explanation. Okay. All right. Now let's go on, right? So so we went on to say mohar kamohar habetulot, right? Like the dowry of virgins. Shehu Katsuv, and now Rashi tells us what is that dowry? Chamishim kesef. He has to set aside, right, 50 pieces of silver. Etzel hatofes et habetula, right? This is interesting. Let me see. Shehu Katsuv, Mishim kesef, etzel hatofes et habetula. Oh, okay. All right. Right. Okay. Regarding the one who seized the virgin. It's saying similar, right? What Rashi is doing here is he's comparing this to a situation of essentially rape. Okay, that's what he's conceding because the Torah talks about rape later on in the book of Deuteronomy. This is the reference here. Okay. Right. So when he says here, Shehu Kotsev, this is referring, what Rashi is saying is that in the situation of rape, he has to set aside 50 pieces of silver, Etzel hatofes et abdullah v'shochev ima ba'ones, because the one who seizes a virgin and lies with her forcibly, okay, has to set aside 50 pieces of silver. Shineemar, as it states in Deuteronomy chapter 22, V'natan ha'ish hashochev ima, the man who has lain with her shall give, sorry, la'avi hana'ara, to the father of the maiden, chamishim kesef, 50 pieces of silver. So in this case too, because it involves a girl who's not married, who is not even betrothed, there's no death penalty or issues like that go on. All right, there are very severe penalties for adultery. Okay. And but in this particular case, 50 pieces of silver. Obviously, the oral law is going to go into this kind of thing. One thing I will explain to you is that the term na'ara is understood in a technical sense by the rabbis, and that is that there are three stages in a woman's development in this regard. One is a katana, that is a minor. A woman is a minor from from 1 year from birth until 12 years of age. And then from 12 to 12 and a half, 12 years and 6 months, she is considered a na'ara. And from 12 years and 6 months and onwards, she is considered a bogeret, which means an adult. And so they're able to take these verses in the Torah and adapt them to fit these kinds of things. Now, when I told you those particular ages, the rabbis were well aware that individuals develop at different stages. And this is basically a rule of thumb, but it has to do with other simanim, other indications of maturity of how a woman is maturing. So that technically, if she was younger than 12 years in a day, but showed certain simanim, she would be considered a na'ara. And past 12, and if she was older than 12 and a half and had not yet developed certain simanim, she might still be considered a na'ara or katana or something. I'm just saying that to you so that you have some idea of the complexity of this particular thing. So that's the process.
Why would that middle stage be so short?
I'm wondering.
What's changing between 12 and 12 and a half that it would
I
be
know. Well, she's in
relevant?
right. Well, she's in the process probably of starting menstruation, etc. But why so that doesn't answer your question. So I think first of all, the first thought that I have is that in some ways making it so short means that some of the very severe penalties, possibly that the Torah is mandating, can be limited to a shorter period of time so that it doesn't have to be mandated, across the board. I think even though rabbinic law is far stricter than basically the way we generally operate. However, on some levels, it's also very progressive. And that's a thought. Now, I haven't studied this. It's not like I'm telling you this on the basis of extensive, investigation and research. It's like just a thought I have based on the knowledge that I do have. So that's basically one approach, which I would hope is helpful and is relatively truthful. Um, there was another thought I had too, and that is that when you're talking about that, essentially Na'ara allows for a transitional stage. And a transitional stage isn't something that's necessarily a lengthy period of time. And 6 months would be long enough and short enough to accommodate that. But as I said, the 6 months essentially is taking into account the period of time in which these various changes take place. As essentially we're talking about the teen years, the onset of puberty and things like that, which require all kinds of changes in a human being. Judith, if I'm not addressing your essential question, please tell me. Also, let me know if this is at least somewhat satisfying.
Yes, but why are they trying to limit the damages so much? This seems very
I think
male-centered.
Yeah, well, it is male-centered from a certain point of view, for sure. I cannot argue that case, okay? Because that now takes us into a whole other issue of trying to understand what the reason was for that particular culture. And I suspect if we understood the circumstances under which they were living, we might have a better sense of it and not just seeing it as a desire to dominate, to have male domination. That there's more to it than that. But I really again don't feel sufficiently competent to be able to argue that case. I just feel that sometimes we take our own values and we just throw them onto other situations and judge those things without being fair about it. And because we're somewhat prejudiced regarding our own personal values, we overlook certain things that might have been important to them at the time. So, it has to do with my overall sort of philosophy. I think it has to do with I studied phenomenology in my as a philosophy major, and I feel that there's a lot of I apply that kind of way of looking at it in terms of study, and to take this million-dollar word phenomenology uh, after 3 years of studying philosophy, and not really having a great sense of it. Nevertheless, here's what I think it basically boils down to is to try and examine what you're examining. If you're studying something, to try to understand it in its own terms and trying to limit the amount of personal, values and judgments on the material. And that you should see, and hopefully you've experienced in the way I've tried to approach my biblical studies. In other words, it's so easy in these, especially in these cases, your reaction is absolutely understandable, Judith. And I think, I want to set that aside before I take any final position regarding, male domination and stuff like that, because there's no question that in some cases, the male of the species has taken, unfair advantage of the position of women. But on the other hand, not to recognize the distinctions between the two and to be respectful of the two, to show deep appreciation and respect for the differences and what each brings to the table in terms of making life livable, etc. That's really what we need to do. And I think trying to say, and again, these blanket statements always have exceptions to them, but to say there's something about masculinity, there's something about femininity that are extremely holy and precious and that we need to appreciate, and especially if we're of the opposite sex. So again, I hope this is, I want to be respectful, and I want to be respectful both to the needs of, where women are coming from in terms of, these issues that they feel have been abusive, and at the same time, I don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I appreciate you asking the question because I suspect it's on a lot of people's minds. But again, I want to give you that opportunity, Judith, please, or anyone in the group here to respond if you're uncomfortable with anything I'm saying.
No, I like understanding what that point of view was and how it is attempting uh, to bring fairness and a sense of proportionality
Right, right.
to the situation.
Yeah.
Um,
Here, can go ahead, please. Oh, Michael, you wanted
oh,
to say
yes,
something? Go ahead. I'm sorry, Judith. Have you finished? I don't want to interrupt
yes,
you.
I am. I'm done.
Okay, okay. Michael?
Yeah. So you said you studied phenomenology?
Yeah, it was one of the subjects I studied as a philosophy major.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you were a philosophy major. So I
I
was thinking
was.
about that last
Yes.
night. I was like, maths and science is so interesting, but actually the base of it, the fundamentals is philosophy, isn't it? Of
Well,
those.
you could say so. I also studied, I minored in mathematics, and at least in the society I was in South Africa, mathematicians kind of looked down on philosophers as being sort of fuzzy, whereas mathematics was sort of precise and much more rigorous. But I think I think that's just, again, a judgment call, you know. Yeah,
And actually, one thing, because I taught, as in I think it was high schools, yeah, physics, and science, other
yeah, yeah.
sciences, and you have to be really, objective.
Right,
Objectivity is,
right.
essential.
Yes.
But essentially what phenomenology is, right?
Well, but it's not objective in the way, let's say, the sciences generally operate, okay? Because again, it's more like sociology. I always think of not sociology, I'm sorry, but if you're a psychologist, right? If you're dealing or a social worker, forgive me, social work, that the basic principle that to be successful in if you're doing something that's social like that, you have to start off meeting your client where they are at. That's a very important principle. That's not necessarily objectivity, All right. Although I can see that in a way you might say it is. But, and the question is, can one really be objective? Is it possible for complete objectivity? Well, even in mathematics, there are sometimes issues where they say, that some statement being made is intuitively obvious, right? And I remember a story being told to me, if I'm not going way off subject here, probably am, but hopefully you'll enjoy it nevertheless, that this mathematician was giving a lecture and going through a certain proof, came to a line and said, and it's intuitively obvious, this particular state, this stage is intuitively obvious. He said this, and there were a lot of objections, at which point they broke off to discuss whether in fact that statement was intuitively obvious. And after an hour's discussion, they came up with a conclusion that it was indeed intuitively obvious. And I hope you're getting the irony involved in that story. If it's intuitively obvious, how does it take an hour to prove it? So,
Yeah, I read that in my math teaching a lot.
yeah.
It's
Okay.
anything that has a proof can also be disproved, in maths.
Well,
So I find it interesting. Yeah, we're kind of like just agreeing on, things are true.
yeah, right. And that's going to be cultural and societal to some extent, to a great extent, maybe. So I think this was an important point to make, even though we're sort of away from the text. I think given what we're dealing with, I think is terribly important, and what's going to follow as well to some extent, that we need to this requires, some discussion before we sort of just move on. Okay. So if it's okay, if you're comfortable, I am going to move on at this point. All right. I don't have a lot of time, so just a little bit more. This is another one that's caused a lot of pain, I think. It says, Macha shefa lo techayeh. You shall not allow a witch to live. You know, you think of people, innocent people who were killed because of this particular verse. And, you know, interestingly enough, it doesn't say, okay, let's take a look at the Rashi, okay, and see what it says. I think that it's interesting, the actual wording of this, okay? I am essentially, while I appreciate where the Torah is coming from because it does seem to advocate the death penalty, I will tell you that in reality, the rabbinic courts were absolutely tilted away from it, that the level of proof that they required was actually more rigorous than is currently required by the United States legal system. Okay. And there were all kinds of safeguards that were put in. One of my favorites is that, first of all, you needed a court of 23 judges to judge a death case, that kind of case. And the rule is that if all 23 judges agreed that the person was guilty of this crime, it was automatically assumed that the person had not received a sufficiently vigorous defense and would not be put to death. There needed to be at least one person who said, no, he was innocent, who would claim his innocence. Interesting. Anyway, let's get into this, right? So he quotes Sanhedrin, by the way, which Sanhedrin talks about to a great extent legal procedures, okay? So, Ella tumat bebeitin, right? She has to be executed by a court. It has to go through a legal process, is essentially what this is saying. Sorry, I put in too many E's there. Okay. Ve'echad zecharim, and the point is this is female, right? The language is female. Macha shefa, you see the here is a female. So he makes the point, ve'echad zecharim, ve'echad, see what he actually uses, nekevod. He says, even though the Torah is saying it in a female, referring to a female, a witch, nevertheless, it applies whether the witchcraft is being done by a man or a woman, it makes no difference. And so now he has to say, Rashi needs to say, why does it say it in this way then? In case you think that wizards are somehow off the, off the the docket here, okay? It's both. Ela shediber hakatuv behoveh, but rather the Torah was speaking in the present situation, meaning, and he goes on, shehanashim mitzuyot machshevot, because witchcraft is found more among women. So again, whether that's true today or not, I don't know. Okay, but at least from the point of view of the time of the Talmud, or whenever these kinds of things were being interpreted, or the time of the Torah, and Rashi's time, quite possibly, and as I said, perhaps it's still true today. I do not know. All right.
How was what a witch was determined?
That is such a great question. In other words, Judith, my understanding of your question is how do you define witchcraft? Okay. I'm not
Yes.
certain. I think of witchcraft, in terms of like our Native American traditions where they take like the hairs of someone, if they found a hairbrush and they would cast spells over it. It's basically, I think, involved in casting spells, things like that. But this is again something, because this is where my knowledge is limited as to exactly how to define witchcraft. And of course, this is necessary. You simply can't apply this unless unless you have a clear definition of what witchcraft is. And I think, in a way, Rashi's answering that question by saying it has to go to a court. And that's because if it is not adjudicated in a proper legal kind of way, the probabilities of misunderstanding and of personal prejudice just skyrocket. You think about these,
What does the Talmud say on that?
I don't know. I don't know. It's not an area that
Were
I,
there female members of the court?
Of
no,
course not.
no, they were not. They were,
Because
yeah, no,
historically in culture, female witches have been seen as evil and male wizards as wise, and they're not really comparable in, the way we look at those words and what they mean. And of course, during the infamous witch trials, these
no,
people weren't all seen practicing sorcery. They
right,
were accused for a variety of reasons, mostly that they were standing out somehow as different,
right.
and it's for the Torah to specify, sorceress, and of course the rest is commentary. It's it's been a very destructive thing,
I know,
ca-
I know.
and there's no way to get around the fact that you know even people who are currently endeavoring to practice spells are not all evil for doing that, and this is definitely a terrible line that I can't get around it. I know it's from the
Mhm.
times,
I know.
but they were persecuting women with this line probably back then too.
So, what I would say is that, interestingly enough, at least within the Jewish sources that I'm familiar with, there's very little mention of this going on. The other thing is, it's absolutely necessary to contextualize this, because you'll see that the very next line has to do with idol worship. So we have to understand sorcery and witchcraft here as having to have some kind of basis in idolatry. And
Actually, the next line is bestiality and then
oh,
idol
sorry,
worship.
Besa. Yes, Bessie, sorry. Forgive me. Thank you again, Lauren. Thank you. I think you've had to correct me every day because of this, and I apologize. Yes, absolutely. And so I suspect it has to do with these kinds of things. But as I said, what's interesting is that there's very little mention that I'm aware of any real practice of witchcraft and stuff. Certainly in the Bible, there is that wonderful, wonderful story at the end of the book of Samuel, the first book of, yeah, let's see, I'm trying to think. Yeah, the first book of Samuel, about the witch of Endor, where Saul goes to see, who, by the way, he was rigorous about killing witches. And I think there's a great deal of literary irony in the fact that he actually goes to this witch of Endor and has her do a seance where she conjures up Samuel. It's so interesting. And the sort of sub message there about, about Saul, and he is not complimented for his behavior. And the fact that he has to wind up going to consult a witch after he himself had done such destructive work, I think is a message that the Book of Samuel's giving us there. But that's the only one I can think of specifically where it talks about witchcraft. And there it has to do with conducting seances. So, yeah,
What
Michael,
what message? What message did it give?
the message that I'm getting is that what Saul did was wrong. That because he had to wind up using one, he had to go to one himself, and had he destroyed every single witch, he wouldn't have been able to do that. And by the way, Samuel basically gets conjured up and says to Saul, "You're going to be with me tomorrow night." Yep.
Is that an evil act in itself? I mean, is
What do you mean?
that is trying to say that we're not supposed to do that either?
Not supposed to do what? I mean, practice seances? Is that
Yeah,
what?
yeah.
The Torah is explicit about it. It says we should not consult with the dead. This is this is also, I think, again, I tend to look at this and saying, what are the positive values that are coming out of this? And to my mind, the positive values of not consulting with the dead is to try to train us to trust God, to understand and to see our lives, in the presence of the divine, and to see God as being our ultimate sovereign Lord.
But that's actually what happened to him, right? I mean,
Yeah, he did. He
he
got killed. He was killed in that battle.
does that
Yeah.
mean that it happened to him because he consulted? He had the
No,
seance,
not at
or
all. No, that's not the reason. No, it's not the reason. There were lots of other
oh,
reasons for Saul. And by the way, Jonathan also dies in that battle. It's a great tragedy. Jonathan is a magnificent character. Yeah. So no, and Saul is a tragic character. He's a tragic character. But again, what do we learn about ourselves and our own humanity through literature? That's the extremely powerful issue going on. To back up a little bit about some of going to that other subject of, male, female kind of that competition, you might say, right? I think it had a lot to do with the concern for raising children, that women were seen as naturally gifted and equipped to raise children, and that it was a very time-consuming kind of thing, which left men with a lot of responsibility to protect the women, et cetera, in that particular society. And the question, of course, is where are our children going? Do we have a lot of angry children? I don't know. These are not simple matters, and again, I want to be careful about coming across judgmental and things like that. So I'd rather just ask the questions. Obviously, I put a lot of faith and trust in the values that I feel the Torah is trying to teach us. But I'm absolutely not into, you know, killing off witches and stuff. I rather see the death penalties mentioned in the Torah as trying to get our attention and saying, you may not think this is important, but it is. And you may not think this is worth giving serious consideration, but it is. That's how I want to see it, rather than saying it's giving a court, or human beings, freedom to go ahead and kill people. So, and then the truth is, the rabbinic material is without any question, very much against. While it can happen, it is absolutely tilted, because once you execute a person, you can't bring their life back again. You cannot do that. And so you want to err on the side of mercy and not on the side of judgment, Right. And we know of so many cases. I mean, they've been documented. I think there are books about them, about people who were improperly executed by a court here in the United States. So, and there is no death penalty in Israel, by the way. So, on the other
except
hand,
for Eichmann.
say that Eichmann, yes, there was a really strong, there had to be a very strong exception. Yeah, but yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop here and just stop recording.